Hi, I'm Rachel Rodert, author of God's Great Love Story, and I'm so happy that you're joining me on this journey through the Bible. I really hope that these videos are helpful to you as you journey through the study either on your own or as part of a small group. In this session, we'll talk a little bit about the reason why I wrote the book, how it might be helpful to you, and also what to expect as you dive a little bit deeper. So we'll start with the reason I wrote this book. It started 7 years ago. At that time, I was experiencing a bit of an emotional low point in my life. I was a young adult still trying to figure out just how to be a grown-up in the world, how to be married, and also how to be a music therapist. I was working in a psychiatric residential setting for at-risk children and teenagers, most of them who had experienced abuse, foster care, multiple placements, and emotional and behavioral struggles along the way. I was hearing their stories every day, stories of poverty and trauma and being unable to trust any adults in their life. It felt so unfair that they had experienced these struggles, and I was having a hard time with it. I was really internalizing their traumas and thinking about them over and over, obsessing over ways that I could just make everything better for them. I was also struggling at that time with a great deal of personal loss. I had just lost my grandmother, who had been the unshakable core of our family and who had been one of my favorite people on earth. I was struggling and not allowing myself to grieve properly for her because I was so focused on trying to be a rock for my family members that were hurting and also be a rock for my clients at work who were hurting from traumas way worse than I had ever experienced. I was obsessing and trying to be perfectionistic and appear like I had everything under control in every aspect of my life, but all I felt in my private life was burnout and a feeling of being unworthy of this role and unworthy to help these people who were leaning on me. So in response to the burnout and unrealistic expectations of myself, I began to fall into a really unhealthy cycle. Some days I would burn the candle at both ends, just trying to do as much as I can and be as productive as I can and check as many things off as I could without taking breaks. Other days, I would have very little energy to do anything. I would sleep in and watch way too much TV and not be very helpful to anyone, much less myself. And the bad thing was I wasn't really leaning on the support people who cared about me, and I wasn't leaning on God either for guidance or support. I was just trying to fix everything and do everything entirely on my own, and it wasn't working. Inevitably, my humanity would show. I would make a mistake or say the wrong thing, and I would obsess over those things. I would replay the imperfections over and over, and that would only contribute to my self-talk that I wasn't enough. When life kind of seemed the darkest, I finally remembered a promise that I made to my grandmother before she passed away. I had promised her to be a little bit more like her. Now, this was a woman who had been a rock and a source of support for so many people in her life. She volunteered in multiple aspects of her community. She cared deeply about her family and being there for them. And she did wonderful things in the world and in her church that I just wasn't prepared to match. I finally realized that my grandmother hadn't been doing all of those things on her own. She was a light to others because of God's light in her. If she wasn't doing it all on her own, what made me think that I had to? I was finally starting to get it. God didn't want me to do it on my own. He had always been there reaching out to me, even as I was pushing him away. Leaning on him would be the only way that I would finally feel happy and content again. It would be the only way that I would ever affect change the way my granny did. The day I finally woke up and realized that was the day that I finally dusted off my Good News Bible and my journal, and I began to write. I began to write about the Bible passages I was reading, rewriting them in my own words to help them make better sense to me. I began to see each passage in a new light, noticing things that I had never noticed before about the Bible, and learning things about God that I never knew before. I began making notes of the eternal lessons and beautiful truths in each story, and I came to realize that I am a precious daughter of God. I'm valuable to Him, and He wants to help guide me and help lead me through this life and into the next eventually. I read the whole Bible this way, rewriting every single chapter in my journal. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first draft of God's great love story. It was like my heart was finally awake again. I was finally recognizing the beauty in God's creation and in myself that had always been there. The more I dove into the Bible, the better I felt emotionally, at work, and in my relationships. I was finally excited to work with my clients again, excited to love my husband, family, and friends well, and excited to serve my church and community like never before. I was excited to live again, and I didn't get there on my own. God did that. God did that by reintroducing Himself to me through these words. The Bible is a 1,200-page compilation of 66 individual books that were inspired by stories of imperfect people just like us, encountering a perfect God. God's Great Love Story is a book that exists to bring the Bible to life as a relevant, compelling love story. Over the past 7 years, reading, rereading, and seeking to better understand these 66 individual books, I've learned this much. From Genesis to Revelation, these 66 individual books tell one cohesive story, and it's a story that's much more complex and beautiful than you may realize. It's a story of a family that was blessed, broken, restored, and set apart. It's a story of war and peace, of politics and scandal. It's a story of the ultimate superhero battling for the hearts of his children in a world broken by those very children. This story is certainly not always pretty, but it's beautiful. And it's bigger than all of us. The Bible is a story of God lifting up little imperfect perfectionists like us and equipping them to do great things. So now that you know a little bit more about the why behind this book, I'd love to walk you through what you can expect over the next 7 weeks in this study. The Bible is a text written by multiple authors with multiple perspectives, written thousands of years ago. There are prophecies and symbolism, genealogies and difficult to pronounce names. For these reasons and more, many Christians I know have never read the whole Bible. Maybe you fall into that camp too, and if you do, it's kind of understandable. There are a lot of barriers that make reading the whole Bible kind of challenging in today's busy culture when we only have time and energy for 140 characters or less. I hope I've removed many of these common barriers in this book by rewriting biblical passages using conversational contemporary language, and by summarizing the heart of each lengthy chapter into just a few sentences. Even with these barriers addressed, I understand the Bible is still a remarkable, complex piece of literature that may be difficult to digest all at once. To assist you in breaking it down and sticking with this journey, I've divided God's Great Love Story into 35 individual readings. For the remaining 7 weeks of the study, you will have 5 daily readings per week. A typical reading will familiarize you with one large book of the Bible or a handful of small books. Daily readings range from 2 to 10 pages in length and should usually take less than 20 minutes a day to read. Each daily reading will start with an introductory page that will summarize the upcoming section, discuss how you can expect God to show up in the upcoming stories, and also introduce you to some of the most pivotal characters you'll meet or lessons you'll discover in these stories. My hope is that each reading will help you discover the simple, beautiful truths that draw the Bible together. Hopefully this helps you understand each Bible story in a fresh light and discover how each biblical book fits into the larger story. Before I leave you to your discussion with your group, I want to get you excited about the stories you'll be able to explore more deeply in week 1. This week you'll familiarize yourself with the first 5 books of the Bible, which make up a text commonly known as the Torah or the Pentateuch. These 5 books outline the history of the nation that Jesus was born into, the nation that God initially set apart and called to have a relationship with Him. Understanding this part of the story can really help us understand how the nation grows, falls apart, and then rises again later in the story. It will help us understand why Jesus even needed to show up in the first place. Genesis will explain how the Hebrew nation started with one unlikely family and how God allowed that family to grow through his miracles and protection. Exodus will discuss how that family fell into slavery in Egypt and was then rescued by God himself with the help of a reluctant leader named Moses. Leviticus helps us understand how God expected his chosen nation to live, and Numbers discusses what the nation experienced as they wandered through the desert to their new home. Finally, Deuteronomy will allow you to read a series of sermons that Moses gave toward the end of his life to inspire the nation of wanderers as they stood on the edge of the Promised Land. Through these 5 books, you'll get a glimpse of the heart of heroes you know, like Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. You'll also hopefully get to meet a few people you've never heard of before who have a crucial place in this story. We get to see just how imperfect each of them was and how God was the one who enabled their lives to be great and influential. By learning their stories of faith and transformation, I hope you're able to draw lessons that apply to your own story. I hope these narratives inspire you to set your pride and imperfections aside and trust God with whatever obstacles you're facing. This is a God who created everything you see here. He frees his enslaved children. He parts seas for them and feeds them with bread from heaven. Our God is truly amazing, and I hope you enjoy getting to know him just a little bit better this week. Thank you, and I hope you have a good one.